Hey, everybody. Welcome to the Social Media and Politics podcast, bringing you expert insights into how social media is changing the political game. I'm your host, Michael Becerra, Associate Professor of Communication at Lund University. Remember, you can follow the show on X at SMNP Podcast or visit us on the web at socialmediaandpolitics.org. All right, y'all. Thanks so much for tuning in. In this episode, we're going to be focusing on the European Union's regulations and initiatives to protect election integrity and fight against online disinformation with my guest, Jakub Szymik. Jakub is the founder of a nonprofit organization called CEE Digital Democracy Watch, where the CEE stands for Central and Eastern Europe. And they've just published a report entitled Protecting Digital Civic Space in the EU, which outlines 5 key areas that will shape the future of EU democracy in the digital age. And these 5 key areas come from conversations with stakeholders in 4 Central and Eastern European cities: Warsaw, Prague, Budapest, and Bucharest. And because Central and Eastern European countries are relative newcomers to the EU, their perspectives on policy are sometimes overlooked. And that is a gap this report seeks to fill, and something we'll talk about more during the episode. You'll find a link to the report down in the episode description, or you'll have to listen to hear these 5 key areas. But we'll also talk about the European Democracy Shield and the DSA. I think most of you are familiar with the Digital Services Act, but this European Democracy Shield is sort of an ongoing initiative that seeks to complement the DSA. And Jakub is an expert in advocating for policy and regulation around the online civic space. And so I wanted to get his perception and perspective on what's going on right now with this European Democracy Shield. And frankly, what's going on with the DSA, because it's in force, but for those of us who are not in policy circles, it's a little bit difficult to know exactly where we are with this policy rollout and its results. We'll also talk about digital political advertising and Gen AI, particularly relating to the recent Polish presidential elections, which were super tight and super important. And Jakub has been both in the Polish elections, but also in the European Parliament elections, monitoring digital ad spend and the policies around them. So we cover a lot of ground in this episode. And I think even if you're not a policy wonk, you'll find the topics that we discuss both interesting and important. So without further ado, let me turn it over to Jakub Szymik. Again, he is the founder of CEE Digital Democracy Watch. Jakub, thanks so much for taking the time out, and welcome to the Social Media and Politics podcast.
Thank you very much. I'm very happy to be here, and I've been a listener for many, many years.
Awesome. So I thought we could start out here with the state of play regarding digital regulation in Europe. I'm sure many of our listeners have heard of the Digital Services Act, but maybe not everyone is familiar with the European Democracy Shield. So could you outline for us what the Democratic Shield is aimed to do and how it fits within the existing DSA?
Yeah, that's a really good question. DSA obviously is quite popular because we've seen it in the wildlife for a few years already. The European Democracy Shield is a new package that was proposed by European Commission. We don't see the final results of works. It's the European Commission and European Parliament working on what this regulation should entail specifically. When it was announced first in 2024 by Ursula von der Leyen, the initial ideas were concerning using deepfakes for political reason, how to navigate this, how to make sure that European citizens are protected from this. And they also focused on coordinating a pan-European anti-disinformation agency. So a body that would be monitoring the web very similarly to what the French, the Swedish, the Polish agencies are doing, but to do it in a coordinated pan-European way. Over the last year, there were multiple ideas being thrown around. Not all of them concern digital perspective, but two of the main pillars that are currently being proposed by the European Commission is safeguarding election integrity across Europe. Obviously, this has a very strong digital element, given that the main risks for the election integrity are connected to digital issues currently, and also protecting the EU from foreign interference. And this is also an issue that rings a bell for many people in digital space and in digital policy. So this is something that is currently being discussed in European Parliament in a specific European Democracy Shield committee. And also there are open consultations by European Commission, and European citizens and NGOs can participate in them.
Yeah, and it seems very much like a complement or an augment to the existing DSA regulation. And I just wanted to ask you kind of where we are with the DSA, because I think, as I mentioned, a lot of our listeners have probably heard about it. It came into force in 2022, but then became fully applicable in 2024. And where are we at with the DSA? Because when the GDPR came into effect, it was very easy to see, at least in Europe, with all these declining cookies and whatnot on various web pages. But I had to actually double check that the DSA was actually in force right now.
This is a very good question, but yes, the Digital Services Act is has been successfully rolled out in most of the member states of the European Union. There are only a few outliers that were already taken to court by the Commission for not fulfilling the implementation of the local coordination bodies across the member states. So this is a network that has been built over the last 2 years, and well, from what we're seeing, they're starting to cooperate between different member states on the national level implementation of Digital Services Act. On the European level, because the Commission also has the competence to work directly based on the provisions of Digital Services Act, we also see some action. We saw European Commission opening investigations to some of the very large online platforms, also around the political issues or the electoral issues. This means that X is being investigated. It means that TikTok is being investigated in the light of Romanian elections from 2024. But we haven't seen any clear results from this. On top of that, the platforms are publishing transparency reporting, and we have a bit more information on how they deal with moderation in national languages, or how many of the flags for potentially illegal content are being taken into consideration by the platforms. And one last thing is that there is some very initial framework on how to navigate the digital platforms participation in the electoral processes across member states. In the Polish presidential election that just closed off 2 weeks ago, we had the rapid response system that was set up at European Commission, and it allowed to connect between the platforms, the NGOs, and national government in navigating those elections when it comes to digital interference. So there are lots of small tools that are growing, and I would say that this network is growing very fast. But still, I wouldn't say that we have full understanding of the rollout of Digital Services Act. One more thing I would like to add is that there are accompanying acts to Digital Services Act that are also impacting how the digital space work for political or socially minded content. One of them is targeting and transparency of political advertising regulation that will be fully enforced from October 2025. And this is something that will impact very strongly what types of political content is allowed on the platforms. But also there's lots of guidelines around the Digital Services Act, around the elections, or around the minors online and how we should keep the internet safe for people who are under 18. So I would say that the network is growing, but I wouldn't say it has such a mass appeal as GDPR had.
Yeah, super interesting. I have so many questions for you. But in particular, you mentioned the recent Polish elections. I know that's something that you've been following very closely. And you mentioned also a sort of rapid response initiative. What does that actually look like?
Yeah, so this rapid response system that was led by European Commission is something that is done as a part of the Code of Conduct on Disinformation. That's part of the DSA. This year, it moved from being a self-regulatory initiative into something that is now binding for all of the signatories, including the very large online platforms and lots of civil society actors, including the fact checkers or other organizations looking at digital democracy. It allowed the NGOs and people from the member states to connect right before the election in a very difficult period where there's lots of disinfo going around, lots of attempts to misinform, to connect with the platforms and flag specific types of content that might be in breach of law or in breach of community standards. This is one of the things that we saw actually in Polish elections. This is something that was launched for Polish elections, but other member states in European Union, they invited the European Commission to create something like a stress test before the election period, where the European Commission invites the platforms, the governments, the civil societies to sit in one table and talk through some of the most risky scenarios involving deepfakes, involving mass amplified disinformation, involving like AI use in the quiet period right before voting. So this is a mechanism that allows to test out the potentially crisis situation and make sure that everyone knows what are the competences, who is doing what, and who has what type of capability before the actual elections happen.
Interesting. And I'm sure we'll come back to the Polish elections as well as the Democratic Shield and the DSA, but I just wanted to kind of lay the groundwork there. And I'd like to zoom out a little bit to your organization's specific focus on Central and Eastern Europe. I mean, on the one hand, these countries are physically closer to Russia and they're often targeted by influence operations. So they're more on the front line of the shield, so to speak. But what other experiences or factors do Central and Eastern European countries share that helps inform digital regulation with a truly pan-European perspective?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much for this question. Most of the countries that we focus on have joined the EU pretty recently, meaning it's been 20 years since Poland joined the European Union alongside Czech Republic, Slovakia, Hungary, or other countries in the region. But still, it is clear in every number that you look at that the representation of those new quote unquote EU countries in Brussels is still not at this level as the old quote unquote EU countries. So what we are trying to do is we're trying to bring those digital policy, digital regulation issues and have a closer look how they play out in those specific countries that have a bit different political history than the Western Europe. You're very right to say that the involvement of Russia and the fact that we're closer geographically and linguistically, culturally, makes it makes it easier for the Russian operations to take place in our territories. And we see it all the time with operations like Doppelganger or Overload or other attempts to misuse the political advertising system to spread pro-Russian propaganda. At the same time, what I mentioned about the political history is the countries here in the Central and Eastern Europe, they had a very strong state interference over the communist times in 20th century. And I feel this leads to lots of distrust towards the state institutions overseeing the freedom of expression. And this is something that we really see across the region, that there are lots of questions about how the state regulation of the digital space will be implemented and how to make sure that this implementation is apolitical and doesn't just work for the governments that are currently in power.
Yeah, that aspect of trust is super interesting. But I think that we are hearing a lot more about Central and Eastern European countries, whether that's the rising Polish economy or Romanian election interference, or of course, the invasion threats to the Baltic countries. But as you rightly noted, a lot of times perspectives from these countries are overlooked. And that was also a key criticism in Mario Draghi's report on EU competitiveness, that a lot of policy experts from this area weren't consulted. So to help address this gap, CEE Digital Democracy Watch organized a series of events to examine 5 key digital areas that will shape the future of EU democracy. Could you tell us about the work that you did there and the 5 areas that you identified as critical?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much for this. It's true that we felt that given that the DSA and other digital regulations are being rolled out across the region, we wanted to check the temperature on how people feel about this. Do they understand it? And if people consider that they will be impacted, or what are the main things they would hope this regulation would address. For this, we managed to coordinate a series of 4 meetings across Warsaw, Prague, Budapest, and Bucharest. And we just listened what people have to say, what they understand from this regulation, and what they feel are the main issues that should be taken into consideration when enforcing this. And this is where we landed on 5 areas that we felt were the most important for people across all of those 4 locations. And this includes the digital election integrity. So how the new tools such as political advertising, the use of political influencers, the use of mass-generated AI content, how it impacts the elections in the region. And there were lots of hopes that the new framework will help in navigating those issues. Obviously, there were some worries that usually it's the national member states that is dealing with something like this, and having the Brussels coordinate this across member states is something new and is something that people were interested how it's going to work and how it's going to make sure that member states are still have full control over the elections and the digital space in their specific region. The second issue is the rise of new tools and tactics, especially focused on AI. There were lots of voices around, how the NGOs, the civil groups, the political groups will be able to use those tools to balance out the potentially bad actors or malicious actors that are already very active in those spaces in our region. And this is something that was brought up from multiple different perspectives, including the automated fact checking, the automated content moderation, how we can make sure that we can trust those technologies to deliver good quality analysis and to bring impact to what the organizations are doing. The third thing was the trust in the regulatory bodies. So making sure that they are apolitical, that the process is very clear and will not lead to state capture of specific organizations that are supposed to take care of this content moderation area online. Some people were worried, and this is the fourth pillar, about the fact that they have limited access to political communications online. So some of the NGOs were saying that the threshold to advertise online for their services is on par with political parties, and they have very rigid rules about like how they're promoting their content, and they can't trust that the algorithm will be showing this content to people who want to hear about this. So there were lots of stories about shadow bans for the organizations that deal with issues that are maybe a bit more controversial or aren't that mainstream. And the last thing is the content moderation. So how to make sure that the local languages have the representation they need. In Poland, we have a very famous example of Twitter or X having 8 million users, but only one Polish-speaking moderator in this language. And Poland is still a pretty big country and a big market compared to other countries in the region. So there were lots of questions about if the platforms are showing enough goodwill and showing enough focus on the countries that don't speak the major global languages. Those conversations were very interesting, and it was good to go a bit deeper than just talking about the risk of disinformation, the risk of influence operations, and seeing what those issues are exactly made of and how they can be addressed at the European and national levels.
Absolutely. And I was reading the write up of these events in a report you published. And one of the things that I noticed that kind of comes across these various areas, whether it's content moderation or new tools and tactics, is this idea of restricting political content, which can be well intended, but can also have adverse effects. So, for example, if you limit Gen AI tools from creating political content, that might curb disinformation, but it might also hamper civil society groups' ability to fully utilize new communication technologies. So could you discuss this dynamic between sort of regulating or limiting political content to protect public discourse, but maybe also working to negatively affect it with the same regulations?
Yes, what we're currently looking into in Europe is the rollout of the transparency and targeting of political advertising regulation. So what we're seeing is that the NGOs or the climate groups or anyone who wants to talk about political issues online and pay for this, yeah? And they have additional thresholds of verification, of putting out their IDs, on putting out the specific card numbers, showing who is paying for this specifically. And this seems to be a hurdle for many NGOs that understand that it's good to know who is paying for political advertising online, but at the same time, they feel that the bad actors who don't have to care about the rules are flooding the web with free content that's possibly generated by the AI or is just a mass coordinated disinformation campaign. So what we're seeing is that even though the standard for good faith actors is rising, the bad faith actors are still finding loops and are finding ways to use those systems to promote their goals, even though the more traditional groups have more issues with using them. So I would say that there's lots of conversation about this balance. And there is also a bit of risk that some of the organizations are feeling that if you raise the transparency requirements for the NGOs and how they communicate online, you get closer to Russian style regulation of, like flagging foreign agents or, like expecting very high transparency levels from civic groups or from NGOs that maybe aren't expected from businesses or are counterproductive to the work they are trying to do. So this is something we heard about a lot, and this is something that we will see play out even further, especially with some of the platforms saying that they will move away from political advertising because they feel that the regulation is so strict that it's difficult to live up to this. And starting from October 2025, if we are to believe Google's announcement, they will be phasing out political advertising in Europe because they feel that they will not be able to live up to the standard proposed by TTPR.
Yeah, it's interesting. This challenge of political advertising has been a problem for NGOs going back to the 2019 European elections. I remember there was something with, to try to stop disinformation, the companies put a regulation that says you can't advertise across borders without making some certain thresholds. And then these NGOs who operate across Europe had to sort of register their various members in different countries in order to be able to advertise, where, of course, the disinformation agents aren't playing by the same rules. But the DSA did try to clarify for us a very long-standing question we've talked about on this show a lot, is what is political content? And in this case, we now have a definition of what is a political ad from the DSA. But in addition to that, what are the other major changes that the DSA has brought to political advertising?
Yeah, so this is something that was very heavily discussed when the regulation was being drafted, is can you regulate the organic political content on the platforms? And should you treat people who have very big platforms, such as influencers who would have over a million followers or even more followers, what level of responsibility they have for using their platform to promote specific political ideas, political parties, or talking about politics? I'm not sure if DSA changes much now, but I would see two other sources of change in recent months. The first one is the fact that in the US-based companies, they changed their policies when it comes to distribution of political content. They are using this a lot, and people who work in marketing industry, they see it all the time that they have to check what works for the algorithm and what doesn't work for the algorithm. Now it seems that, at least on Meta, there are looser rules when it comes to talking about politics on the platform, and they are encouraging a bit more those diverse political voices. This is something that has been difficult to understand what are the actual outcomes of this, because some of the more progressive groups are saying that this will allow more of hate speech or more of aggressive content on the platform. Some people are also worried that it will put people further into the viral bubbles or will make it more easy for people to go down the rabbit holes of political content, where I have no research on the results of those changes, but still the fact that platform can change very strongly how they amplify specific political content, how they share it, how it circulates on the platform. This is something that impacts the political discourse in the EU very heavily. One other thing is that obviously in the recent years, we saw a very big change in how much trust we have towards anonymity online, because all of the things that we're talking about, whether they are based on DSA or transparency of political advertising, they show that there is not as much trust in anonymous political opinions, given that they can be amplified algorithmically, that on Twitter you can buy political advertising, even though they will not verify how it's paid for or who's behind that. It's definitely a vibe change in the last decade, where it was very easy to protect anonymity online a decade ago, but now there are more and more voices to make sure that we know who's talking to us and we know how those messages are amplified.
Yeah. And I mean, thinking about political advertising, also the development of Gen AI technologies, I mean, there's been such a concern, especially last year with all of the elections in Europe and elsewhere, that you'd have this just flood of deepfakes and Gen AI content that would just cause kind of mayhem in various elections. And that didn't seem to materialize last year. And I'm wondering about your work in the Polish elections. Did we see any type of major Gen AI or disinformation campaigns? And how was the political advertising landscape there overall?
Yeah, this is very, very important question. And I also was in the group of people expecting like very big bang moments of Gen AI use or synthetic media use in the campaign. I don't think it materialized in a way that we expected. So one of the benchmarks that we had was Slovakian campaign, where deepfaked audio of one of the candidates was leaked online right before the silent period, right before the vote. And it had a clear intention to misinform or to sow distrust and hate and chaos right before the elections. We didn't see something similar in Poland this year, but what we saw is that the AI use feels very organic now. So the synthetic media are all around. People are generating lots of short TikTok videos, or like there's massive use of smaller bits of content that are using those tools. And it feels that people are used to it in a way. It feels like it's distorting the reality a bit, but those aren't major big events, but they are smaller, more organic use of those tools by lots of accounts, some of them more official, some of them anonymous accounts that are doing satire online or are sharing some imaginary scenarios with the use of generating videos or audio or online imagery, and lots of this goes viral. Yeah, so like we see that this type of content is very popular, and we are not exactly sure how many of the users understand that this is generated content or something that reflects reality. In Polish elections, obviously, we saw lots of Russian influence. The operations I mentioned, doppelganger, overload, were very much present in those presidential elections. We also monitored the political advertising spending in Poland that was quite high this year. It was around 3.5 million euros. So this is way more than in the previous campaigns, such as the European parliamentary campaign. And there obviously were some issues because we have quite transparent systems of political advertising on Meta and on Google. We are able to see in real time, we should be able to see in real time who is spending those money. And this wasn't always the case. The platforms were showing the authors of some of the advertisements that weren't always right, weren't true. Sometimes they were using fake websites or fake addresses, like physical addresses in Poland. And it led to quite a few scandals around the political advertising online in Polish elections. One thing that I feel might be interesting also for the global audience is that it was the first time that we had an actual influencer who was running in the presidential election. His name was Krzysztof Stanowski, and he didn't do very well in the polls. He received barely over 1% of public vote, but he was running the biggest political platform on YouTube, and his channel, Kanał Zero, it monetized at around 350,000 euro every month of the campaign. So it's very interesting to see this merge between people who are running in the elections to grow their online platforms, but at the same time, their big online platforms are being used as one of the main channels of influence during the campaign.
Yeah, that's super interesting because I'm also thinking, I mean, I'm sure that Poland has some type of spending caps on how much parties can use for advertising. That's kind of a general European thing. But I guess if you were a YouTube influencer, if the channel was monetized, then you could essentially raise money and then continue to spend it. I guess what I'm trying to say is that, in the US, you have this huge culture of donating to political parties. And in addition to spreading influence and trying to get votes, I guess you could also generate money for your own advertising through YouTube. But I hadn't thought about that before.
Yes, this is very interesting, and there is definitely a cultural clash between how the campaign spending is perceived in the States and in Europe. And this is where we feel that lots of even of the pan-European approach with regulations such as DSA or the upcoming European Democracy Shield, it's difficult for those regulations to fill in the gaps because the local regulations, they are very tight. They are not used to the online era of campaigning, and it's difficult to see where the image cracks and where are the loopholes that are being used or misused by multiple actors in this process. So it feels like a part transparency. Like we have some transparency on the side of the platforms, especially when it comes to the political spending. We're not talking about the organic content, but the political spending. And then it's difficult for the states to keep up with this and actually implement this knowledge into something valuable on the compliance and oversight side of things.
Absolutely. And I think, like you mentioned, I think what's interesting also is this idea of Gen AI content being kind of normalized, where people are just kind of doing this and putting up their fake videos or TikToks or whatever. And then some of that goes viral. And it makes it really difficult to anticipate that this would happen, 5 years ago. So I'm wondering, because you've been monitoring digital ad spending and the policy around it at the European level for some time, and your organization, CEE Digital Democracy Watch, published a list of priorities for what the Democratic Shield should prioritize when it comes to policy actions. And one of those suggestions was a comprehensive, exhaustive, and politically independent monitoring system to uncover online manipulation campaigns. And so given all of these challenges, I'm curious, like in an ideal world, how would you envision such a system to do that?
Yeah, thanks for quoting this. And this was actually one of the proposals that we made. It's something that I believe is already happening in pan-European way. There are European media observatories that are following the disinfo campaigns across Europe. The European external action bodies are also focused on how to navigate the foreign interference attempts in European Union. So there are initial places where work like this is happening on the European level. One of the other things that we proposed in cooperation with Foundation of European Progressive Studies, that is a think tank that is closely connected to more progressive European parties, is also more transparency on the biggest influencers and more transparency on the monetization mechanisms, which we talked about earlier when it comes to the YouTube candidate. So I'm not exactly sure if making a stronger framework on the public side is a response to all of the issues. The arguments about the potential politicization, they still stand. And I'm not sure if we're at the stage where there is a common understanding of what disinformation is, what FIMI is across all of the European nations. But more transparency alike to the political advertising transparency for influencers and how they are paid and who's paying them, especially if they talk about political stuff, and how the platforms share their revenue with the most viewed political accounts is something that we believe is feasible in this European Democracy Shield package.
Definitely. And I'm thinking about, on the one hand, you have the complexity of the online environment, right? Things are just changing so fast. But then on the other hand, you have the complexity of the EU itself as a, very technocratic and supranational governance structure. And I'm just thinking about, and you've written about this before in the context of political ad regulation, that you can have content that conforms to the DSA, but then also violates national election laws. And we're thinking about online communication. It's just one of these things that's very easy to cross national borders. So just thinking about the complexity of EU governance as supranational, do you think that regulating the digital civic space is technically or legally a feasible objective?
I think we're moving in good direction. Like we definitely support the ideas that European Union is putting out there, and we support that there should be a bigger framework. Like it's way better to have a pan-European approach to this than a very fragmented national level approach. And we still feel there is time to see how DSA actually works. Because as mentioned in the beginning of our conversation, we still haven't seen results of the investigations into the very large online platforms, especially around the political content. This is a sensitive issue also, taking into consideration the US and EU relation and how important the freedom of expression seems to be to the US government currently. So I would wait for those results. I feel that lots of people are very impatient and are saying, oh, it isn't working. We still didn't see any result of the law that we have. But I feel that it requires effort on the civil society side, on the platform side, to also put it in action and actually fill it with meaning, especially with things such as the rapid response system or stress tests being possible. So what I feel is the most important is to build the bridges between what the EU envisioned and how the member states understand this, and also strengthening the national capacities of working in this European system. This is why your questions about European Democracy Shield are so vital here, because it's a good moment to think whether we need to put in more digital regulation or should we just make good use of what's already out there, but is still being rolled out across the EU.
Definitely. I mean, policy takes time to craft, it takes time to implement, and it takes time to see the results. But we've covered so much ground here. I think that, Jakub, you've definitely caught our listeners up to speed on what's happening on the digital civic space in the EU. So thanks so much for taking the time out and sharing your insights with us.
Thank you very much, and thanks for having me. The full report will be available on our website, so I invite everyone to have a closer look and discuss.
I've just been speaking with Jakub Szymik, founder at CEE Digital Democracy Watch. Check the episode description for the links to the report and other resources we've been discussing in this episode. And that's a wrap for this episode of the Social Media and Politics podcast. Thank you so much for tuning in. I was super excited to see that the podcast won a Public Scholarship Award, so thank you to whoever nominated the pod. I'm sure that must be a hardcore listener who listens to the end of the episode. But we'll continue on next time with a discussion of content moderation versus free speech. But until then, I'm your host, Michael Becerra, signing off from Alma. See you next time.